So today I'll have the opportunity to talk with you about recovery in terms of the experience and the evidence that supports the idea that recovery is not the privilege of a few exceptional people, but is rather a possibility for anyone diagnosed with major mental disorders. And then also in the later parts of my remarks to share with you what I see as the future of services as we move towards them, and also some very concrete things we can do in the present to begin to change our professional competencies to support people more effectively in the recovery process.
Being a psychiatric patient means that you lose a lot of roles. What are you losing?
I think many things. The first thing you lose is your name, and we are called by our diagnosis. And we're also given the message that we should live the diagnosis as opposed to living our lives.
This illustration symbolizes how I was seen by other people and how I understood myself before being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And you'll notice that the first thing that strikes you about the illustration is there's wholeness and an integrity to the flower. At the center of the flower is my name, Pat, and that's how I knew myself. That's what everybody called me. And just like you, there were many aspects of who I was as an individual. There was my culture, my family, my friends, my sexuality, my work history, my politics, my class background, my spirituality, etc. So I was a multidimensional, multifaceted person as I am today. And also importantly, you'll notice on the flower that there's an empty petal at the top. Now this empty petal is very important because it symbolizes the idea that our lives, as we stand in the present, open onto a future. And that future is, very importantly, ambiguous and uncertain. Martin Heidegger, the great philosopher, once said that to be human means to be a question in search of an answer. And I always enjoyed this definition of being human, because it means that life is a quest, life is a journey, life is an unfolding question in search of answering. And that what it means in some very essential way to be human means that we're always projected and up to something, always questioning, not just in adolescence, but in adulthood, and even hopefully into old age, always asking, who am I, what am I up to, and who will I be today? And the reason I'm stressing this idea of the open petal on the flower is because it's precisely in this area where life opens onto a future which is ambiguous and uncertain, that a very great wounding occurs. And this wounding has nothing to do with any disorder or distress that brings us into mental health services. Rather, this is a wounding, a deep wounding to the heart and of humanity itself that occurs because of the way most of us who are diagnosed with mental illnesses are treated once we enter into the system and are labeled with disorder.
And so that's probably one of the most fundamental and in some way profound thing that we lose is our name. And those of us who accept the diagnosis as identity, I think, are in for a much harder road because recovery is about living our lives, not living our diagnosis.
Just to give you a sense of who I was, just prior to being diagnosed, I enjoyed athletics. I was a terrible student. I did everything I could to avoid paperwork or reading or writing, but I loved basketball and baseball and all manner of sports. And my dream as a teenager was to become a coach for a women's athletic team. And as I stood at the age of 17 years old looking out onto my future, that was my aspiration, that was my hope. Now, as I said, the future is uncertain and ambiguous, and little did I know, as I stood there on the threshold of my 17th year, that in fact, rather than becoming a coach, I was going to go crazy instead. Things are never so certain. And indeed, in the week between Christmas and New Year's of my senior year in high school at the age of 17, I had a psychotic episode, my first one. And of course, I didn't call it that at the time. I still don't know if I would really call it that. It was a dramatic change in my consciousness, and I experienced it as being very frightening. I began to first lose any sense of depth perception. I became quite uncoordinated and unable to handle a basketball efficiently and with skill. And instead, I found myself wanting to withdraw because I was very, very frightened. And I began to hear voices that were very distressing, that were saying cruel and very unpleasant things about me, and things that I would prefer not to repeat in public, but which were very disturbing and impossible to ignore at that point in time. Also, I began to have a belief that was very strong, very compelling, that the people around me, my teachers, my family, my friends, the people around me, although they looked the same and although they acted the same, somehow their identity had been changed by some alien force that was slowly taking over the world, and in particular the people of the world. So you can imagine that I felt very isolated and very alone, and at a time when I most needed to reach out to people, I believed you weren't there. Within a fairly short period of time, I was taken to a mental institution and diagnosed with schizophrenia. And once I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, everything began to change in terms of how others viewed me. In this second illustration, you see that an illustration of how I was seen by other people after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Once diagnosed with schizophrenia, the disorder took on a master status in terms of my identity. Notice that my name, Pat, is no longer at the center of the flower. Instead, my diagnosis, schizophrenia. And if you have a diagnosis, just put yours there, because that is the experience. That the fact that I had friends or beliefs or values or hopes and dreams, my spirituality, all of that was very unimportant to the people who were working with me, and later to my family and friends. What mattered the most important defining characteristic, according to the people who were working with me, was that I was first and foremost a schizophrenic. And this became the lens through which all of my behavior was now interpreted and understood. You'll notice there are some squiggly lines on the illustration. And those squiggly lines represent the idea that it was as if professionals and then later my family and friends began to look at me through a lens that distorted who I was, the lens of psychopathology, the lens in which all of my behavior was interpreted as part of disorder. Let me give you an example. Growing up as a kid, I was always a very active child. I grew up in a big Irish Catholic working class family, and my idea of hell was a rainy day when everyone was crammed into a very little house together and we didn't get to go out and run. And my grandmother, a little Irish grandmother, she would say, "Oh, Patricia, go on out and blow the stink off you." Now, what that means, if you don't speak Irish here, is that means go on outside and run all that energy off until you're calmed down enough to behave yourself in the house. And so I knew myself as an active child, an active person, who now and again had to go out and blow the stink off her. And needless to say, once in a mental institution and diagnosed with schizophrenia, the nursing staff were not writing in their chart, you know, the girl has the jig, she has ants in her pants, and she must, the treatment is to go blow the stink off her. This is not what they were saying about me in my clinical notes. Instead, they were saying the very same characteristic, the very same person, but now, oh, she's agitated. Okay. Another example, I tend to be a quiet, contemplative sort of person who feels terribly comfortable speaking to a large audience, but one-on-one in a social situation, I tend to be shy and really to prefer to be in nature and to be alone. This is a lovely quality of who I am. And yet, the same quality, once in a mental institution diagnosed with schizophrenia, being viewed through the lens of psychopathology, I wasn't a lovely, quiet, contemplative thinker anymore. I was aloof, guarded, suspicious. Huh? See my point? No matter what I did, too active, not active enough, too happy, not happy enough, too sad, not sad enough, too active. It just went on and on. No matter what you did, you feel as if you're in a glass box, which on one level is invisible, yet is very tangible. You feel trapped. And even to begin to protest this entrapment, wait, your interpretation of me is not me. What do the professionals say? Oh, you lack insight into the fact that you're ill. See, even further proof. Oh, you're getting angry now. Further evidence of the illness, so that you really do feel captured in the gaze, and eventually a process of colonization occurs where we actually begin to believe these things about ourselves, this interpretation of ourselves. We begin to internalize it. We become colonized by a psychiatric view of ourselves, and that can lead to even further trouble.
And that the viewpoint of mental health professionals far too often is so very narrow that they see us only within a disease, illness, or distress context, and they forget that we are whole people just like they are, with interests, abilities, talents, and gifts, and a deep, deep desire to participate fully in the human community, which includes the economic fabric of the community, the cultural fabric of the community, the interpersonal and family dimension of the community. These are dreams that we share with the rest of humanity. We're not set off as some other group that is somehow less than human. I think our aspirations are quite similar to those of other folks, and that and it's only within this context of our full humanity that we're ever going to find our revolution, that we're ever going to take our place as full citizens, demanding our full rights and benefits and responsibilities that go with the culture.
Once diagnosed with schizophrenia, I knew that I needed to ask my psychiatrist, what is this thing you say I have? And so by my third hospitalization, I did ask the psychiatrist what I had. I was all of 18 years old at the time, and I'll always remember what he said. He said, Miss Deegan, you have a disease called schizophrenia. Just like a person with diabetes needs to take medication for the rest of their life, you will have to take haloperidol for the rest of your life, and then I think maybe you can cope. And I remember feeling stunned by this message of hopelessness, and I've come to call this message a prognosis of doom. Essentially, the psychiatrist was saying to me that for all intents and purposes, my future had been closed off. I was no longer among the human community whose futures are open and ambiguous. Rather, I was now a disordered person, a carrier of disease, and my future had already been written in a textbook somewhere. And he had read that textbook. And that textbook said that people with schizophrenia don't get well, that people diagnosed with schizophrenia must stop living, avoid stress, stay away from school, stay away from work, not enter into relationships, never parent, and essentially retire from life at 18 years old. This was very much the message I was given. And something in me began to, as he pronounced this prognosis of doom, reject in a powerful way what he was saying to me. I was smart enough not to reject it too vocally, because that would have been seen as yet further proof that I lacked insight into the fact that I was ill. We need to watch out for this little trick we play clinically when we say, oh, the client lacks insight. Do they lack insight, or do they simply disagree with us? I was disagreeing with that psychiatrist, not lacking insight. I had a different viewpoint, my viewpoint being that somehow I could be something more. And so I felt this passionate, angry indignation rise up, saying, no, you're wrong. But I kept that to myself. I left the office and went and stood out in the corridor outside of his office in the hospital. And I remember having a thought. I'm not going to be a mental patient for the rest of my life. What am I going to do? And a thought came to me that had never come to me before. I'm going to become Dr. Deegan so that I'll have enough power to change the mental health system. Now, thank God for adolescents who can think thoughts like single-handedly changing a mental health system. But it was a beautiful dream. Over time, I learned that it would be a far more cooperative and long-term effort than one superwoman could do by herself. But that came later. For me, that dream was a turning point. And I know Alain Topor has written a fair amount about turning points in the recovery process. And this was a powerful turning point for me, because I, at that moment, found something, a dream, an idea, a mission around which I could organize my recovery. And I think that this is very important, because we can't organize our recovery around a vacuum. We can't organize our recovery around nothingness. That our recovery needs to organize around something. And for me, that something was dedicating my life to changing the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again. And although I wish I could tell you that recovery came like a bolt of lightning at that very moment and onward I went with the rest of my life, that's not at all what happened. Instead, what happened was that I went right back home and sat on the couch and smoked cigarettes and drank high-test Coca-Cola, which is what I did all day, every day, day after day, and month after month after month after month. That's all I did. And I wish I could say that having had that turning point, it all changed, but it didn't. Something shifted, but no one else could see it. And I say this because I think it's important, I think because at the heart of recovery there's always a type of mystery. I think we should always be trying to understand it and bring the empirical inquiry to it, but we'll never fully grasp this idea of recovery through science. That at its heart, recovery is about lives rebirthing themselves. Recovery is about lives rebirthing themselves, and to work in this field means to have the privilege of, at times, even helping to midwife that rebirthing. And that this is an honor and a privilege, and should very much animate the work that we're doing. So for me, I went back and sat on the couch, and I didn't get off the couch for many months later. And I think back on what is it that I did in terms of taking the first active step in my recovery. I had had this turning point, this internal shift. I now had a survivor's mission, which, importantly, I was very careful not to run off and tell my treatment team. If I had run off and told my treatment planning team, they would say, Ms. Deegan, what is your goal for this year, and I would say, "Doctor, my goal is to become Dr. Deegan and to change the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again." They would have said, "This is a delusion of grandeur. More haloperidol." So I kept it a secret, huh? I kept it to myself. Partly, too, because I knew that it was a fragile dream, and I needed something to be mine. I'm sure no treatment team, if you're not diagnosed, no treatment team writes down your life dream. And there was something important in keeping my dream to myself, partly because it could be easily broken, and I needed to test it out in the water by myself. So I had to, of course, take a step beyond the turning point and actually do something different, because recovery is about changing our lives. Not necessarily changing our biochemistry, but changing our lives. And so for me, that very first step came, my grandmother again, the little Irish lady. She would come into the room where I would sit and smoke cigarettes. She would come in once a day, and she would say, "Patricia, would you like to go grocery shopping?" And I would say, "No." And off she would go, and she would come back the next day. "Would you like to go food shopping?" "No." And off she would go. I should have gotten suspicious because she came in on Sundays and asked the same question even when the stores are closed. But she was a wise old woman. And she said to me one day, "Patricia, would you like to go food shopping?" And for reasons that I can't account for, that day, at that moment, I said yes. And I added the caveat, "But I will only push the cart. I will not put anything in it. I will not unload it. I will only push it." But pushing a grocery cart down the aisle of a grocery store was the first active step that I took in my recovery. And that first step was the first step in the journey that has led me to Copenhagen to be here with you today. And for me, this is something that, when I have this remembrance, brings me a sense of awe and wonder at the power of taking one step and another step and another step.
It is said that the people can stand in everything except losing the meaning of their lives. Why do you think that the people who treat us, they take away the hope and the meaning of life because they're not evil? But why do they do it then?
Yes, wouldn't it be easy if we could just say they're evil? Wouldn't it be easy if we just said, well, it's because they're ignorant, and we could simply educate them or give them religion and make them not evil? But it's not so simple an issue. So it's a good question. I think some of it has to do with training. The way that these professionals are trained. I myself underwent the training. I thought that I would become a clinical psychologist and that would teach me everything I needed to know, only to go ahead and get the PhD in clinical psychology and find out that no, the answers I was looking for were not in the profession. So some of this bias or this tendency to see disease rather than human being is really something that is trained. I have some very fascinating studies in the history of psychology, and I've gone into abandoned institutions, mental institutions in the United States, and found old clinical records. And I found a particularly fascinating one of nursing students who were young and coming into the field for the first time. And they had to keep a journal where they, from memory, recounted their conversation with patients. This would have been back in the 1960s. When I found these journals in the 90s, but they were quite ancient and laying on the floor. And the nursing students, because they were new to the field, would write very simple things like, "I met Judy today. She's a 60-year-old woman. She reminds me a lot of my grandmother. She likes to laugh and talk about her children. Sometimes she's very sad because her husband beats her." And they would write these about the conversations they had with these patients in the state hospital. But then, in red ink over the top of the students' handwriting were the notes from their nursing supervisors. "Cross that out. She's not like your grandmother.
she's a mental patient, cross this out. She is not an interesting and humorous person. She is having ideas of grandeur and flight of ideas, and that's not laughter, that's hypomania. And so what I began to see through this editing process, the mentoring of a nurse to her student, was her taking the fundamental humanity of the nursing student and putting it through a prism or a lens, which began to distort the human being she was encountering and turning it into an illness. And it's been a very educational study, because I got to see right there in pen and ink how some of that transformation in the education of professionals takes place, how they are taught to study, to measure, to objectify human experience, to make it other. And I think, and then they become very good at looking at people through that prism or the lens of illness, thereby forgetting the strengths and the resilience that we as full human beings bring to what are sometimes very difficult life events. Once having gone grocery shopping a few times and starting to make some small steps, it dawned on me that if I was going to become Dr. Deegan, I had better go to school. So, once making the decision to go to school, there were many new challenges that faced me, and I had to begin to develop some coping strategies.